Rural Hertfordshire, summer 1972. "I can take you as far as here, my friend," the amiable hippie guy said as he eased the VW Beetle into the lay-by. "I just live up the road. I'm sorry I can't take you further. There is a bus route into Albury, and there should be one due in about 20 minutes. The bus shelter's just over there." He made a laid-back gesture with his finger as a guide. "The buses don't run regularly round here, but you've timed it right for the village one." The passenger was a young man, no older than 22. He wore faded flared jeans and a Simon shirt. His hair was fashionably long, but not as long as the hippie's hair, who'd sensibly tied it back into a ponytail. "Thank you," said Derek Lewis gratefully. "You've been very kind." "Well, man, we've got to help each other," said the hippie earnestly, and gave his young passenger a wise man's smile. "You never know when you're going to need help yourself." Derek smiled and thanked the hippie once again for his kindness. The hippie wished him well and told him to take care. They shook hands and Derek opened the door. Derek reached down and grabbed his canvas rucksack from the rear seat and swung it over his shoulder. He thanked the hippie again and waved as the VW clattered down the lane and vanished into the shadowy woodland. What a genuinely nice guy, thought Derek, as he adjusted the rucksack across his shoulder. He looked down the empty lane and walked across the road towards a small wooden hut-like bus shelter. How helpful that guy was. He was alone, in the middle of the countryside. He enjoyed the feeling of absolute solitude, but then he always found a certain solace when out in the open, away from the towns. It was warm, and the heat made the tarmac wiggle. Birds whistled, and the summer bugs flitted around like dust motes. The peace and quiet of the rural lane felt so surreal. It was as if time had suddenly stopped, and everything had become strangely immobile. He leaned back against the side of the shelter and waited. He checked his Timex watch and sighed. It had been quite a journey. He felt tired, which was hardly surprising. He'd been travelling since 9 o'clock that morning. First the train, then a bus, then he'd hitched a lift. He was glad that guy in the VW had stopped, otherwise he would have still been walking that busy stretch of road some 20 miles back. It was nice that there was still compassion in some people. The thought of it made him feel warm inside. Derek tugged out a dented pack of cigarettes. He had 2 left. He should have bought a fresh packet, but he had forgotten. There had been ample opportunity to buy another pack at the railway station kiosk, but he had been too preoccupied with seeing his girls. They'd been more important to him, far more important than buying cigarettes. He made a sour face and took one out and lit it. It tasted good as he inhaled, and he felt relaxed as he waited, sat down by the shelter beneath the warm afternoon sun. Birds twittered away in the nearby trees. A light breeze gave him relief from the heat. It felt peaceful and remote, and he closed his eyes and let time drift by. The countryside smelled sweet. The aroma of freshly trimmed grass was heavy in the air. It was a cloying smell, but not unbearable. Everything in the countryside was forgivable and relaxing. Out here there were hardly any people, which meant less hassle and less competitiveness. It was good to get away from the prying eyes and the judgmental souls of the city. He loved being out here, in the middle of nowhere, away from the vile populace. This was his only respite, a short reprieve from a world that often saw him as a laughable misfit. People had always been a grave disappointment to him, had always singled him out for being a loner. It was as if they couldn't understand him, couldn't talk to him. It was as if he created an awkward atmosphere for them, and what people couldn't understand, they would attack. It was a premise that had long been ingrained in him. But he liked his own company, and anyway, what did they know? How could they justify their opinions about him? Just because he didn't crave their acceptance didn't make him a bad person. Some people liked being alone. There was nothing markedly strange about that. Solitude was a gift to be cherished, so why should anyone be persecuted for preferring it? People had always been a never-ending source of disappointment. He just wanted to be left alone, that's all. But people couldn't do that. They would never allow him that meagre concession. The more he thought about them, the more he sensed the indignation rise within him. He suddenly felt angry. But that was the effect that pondering about people usually had on him. Sometimes it would fuel and heighten his aggression to a dangerous pitch, and yet, conversely, it could make him feel afraid and cause him to slink away into a quiet corner where he would rock himself into an eventual calm. Yeah, some people are nasty and shallow, he thought. Having had no medication that day had begun to affect him, had made him feel hyper-paranoid. That was a place he didn't like to visit. That was where all the demons lay in wait for him, ready to lash out at him, just as they had done all those years ago when they'd locked him away in that awful place. The place where time had seemed to stand still and nothing appeared to be real, where doctors had talked gibberish and psychiatrists had written reports that made little sense. And although he was free of that place, the spectre of the psychiatric hospital was always lurking in some darkened recess of his mind, always lingering there, as if waiting for his return. The thought made him grind his teeth in anger. He'd rather die than go back there, back to that place, with its brutal nursing staff and patronising doctors and drugs that turned you into a zombie. The blank stares, the distant cries, the uncertainty of never knowing if a nurse was going to abuse you. He'd seen the dehumanisation of patients that no one ever listened to, their inarticulate concerns constantly drowned by a doctor's professional eloquence, and then forgotten. It was a medical dictatorship under one huge roof, and the cries and degradation went unanswered and unchallenged. No way was he ever going back to that hospital again. He'd take his own life first, then return to the Milmere psychiatric unit. He puffed aggressively away on the filter tip as painful memories drifted into his head. He tried to fight them off, but he was in his most vulnerable state, and there was no fortification to avert it. Normally the drugs stemmed such oppressive and hurtful feelings, and his lessened dosage hadn't been a good idea. Now he felt unprotected, open to attack, and he inhaled deeply on his cigarette to fight off the inevitable demons that would be visiting shortly. His abusive father was the first face that grew from out of the darkened recesses of his troubled mind, that sneering, sadistic expression, with the alcohol-reddened cheeks and the mocking eyes. "You'll never be anything, you," said his father in a tone that was half mocking and half callous. "You? Get a girlfriend? You've no confidence, never had, never will have. You're not like me. You'll never be like me. I'm the bull in this family. I'm the real man." "And what do you know, you old bastard?" uttered Derek softly through clenched teeth. "What do you know about anything?" His father laughed and then backed away into the darkness. Then a series of provocative girls from his school days began chanting. Their voices seemed to drown out his thoughts and feelings. "Derek, skinny boy, never gets any joy. No one likes him, everybody hates him. He's so freaky, freaky. The chanting went on and on, towards an intolerable upsurge. "Shut up! Shut up!" said Derek, through clenched teeth. "Leave me alone!" The chanting morphed into echoes of laughter, and then began to fade away. Derek placed his hands over his ears and closed his eyes. Eventually, the taunting cacophony died, and their faces faded into the darkness. His mind was quiet again, at peace. It was as if a sense of equilibrium had given him a reprieve, and he was grateful that it stabilized. He let out an elongated sigh of relief. He hadn't taken his medication for the last 2 days, and the doctor had warned him in the past not to lower his dosage. But the medication had made him feel sleepy, drowsy, so he hadn't bothered. He didn't want to feel tired because he was meeting his girls, his best friends, in the village of Albury. He wanted to feel alive, happy and full of life. He didn't want to lumber round in some chemically induced lethargy. He lay down on the warm green grass and thought about Wendy, Jane, Linda, and the beautiful Gillian. He dreamed about his impending reunion and saw them all, waiting, smiling, welcoming. He focused on Gillian. Gillian. He recalled her long blonde hair that smelled of apples when they'd met, her beauty and softness. Had it really been so long since they'd all been together? His mind drifted, wandered, and within it he found so many fond memories of Gillian and the others. He'd met the girls during the summer of 1968, and then the following year he'd met Gillian, and he'd been happy with her. But just like the others, she had wanted to leave for university and had got a place to study at Manchester. She'd been ambitious, dissatisfied with living in the country. She'd intended to leave him and give up their relationship to study biology. It had been devastating news for him to be told that. He had felt the bitterness of her words, and they struck home like a terrible betrayal. Gillian had been so resolute in her manner. She was going to university, and that was final. Her tone had been so cutting back then, so brutal. It led to an argument. How could she have been so dismissive of him, so distant? Of course, he'd talked her out of it. Now she was waiting for him. She would never have been happy away up north, studying with all those clever people, with all their clever banter, all those big words, going on political demonstrations. She was happier with him, and she told him she was happy. In fact, they all did. They all concurred that they were happier with him. His girls would now be with him forever. Nothing would ever part them again. He sat smiling to himself, then heard the bus approach. The clatter of a labouring diesel engine shattered the rural quietness. It was an old bus, in faded blue, with dirty coachwork. But at least it was transport, and that's all that mattered. He stood up and grabbed his rucksack. The old bus slowed and pulled up sharply, its brakes screeching to a burdensome halt. He got on the bus and paid, and sat at the back. Being selective, he sat beside an elderly woman who'd smiled at him. It was a much welcome gesture, and such an action had provided him with an opening gambit for conversation. Sensing her acceptance, he started chatting about meeting his friends in Albury and how he missed living round here. It was amazing how he could turn on the charm when he wanted to. It was as if he had a natural affinity towards the elderly, and he engaged the old woman in friendly banter. Her eager reciprocation gave him the impression that she was lonely, and she seemed thankful for the conversation. Derek was happy to oblige. He liked chatting to old people. They were so trusting, and often so credulous when talking to seemingly amicable strangers, but they had nothing to fear from him. Derek actually liked old people, and had always shown a genuine respect towards the elderly. They seemed to accept him without question, and made him feel normal. To Derek, they were comforting, a palliative of sorts. "Have you been away long?" asked the woman, with polite interest. "Oh, a good 3 years," said Derek morosely. "I sadly left the area in 1969. Dad wanted to move, you know. He missed the city. I was heartbroken when I had to leave." "It's such a shame when families move on," said the old woman sympathetically as she sensed his hurt. "Some people grow settled, and others don't. Well, at least you're back and still have friends here." "I do," Derek said as he gazed out at the passing countryside, "and I feel so blessed that I have." The old woman smiled. He seemed such a nice young man and ever so polite. He was certainly a far cry from the unruly youths that lived near her, and it made a refreshing change for her to talk to someone. The bus pulled into the bus stop at Albury just beyond the duck pond. Derek said his polite goodbyes to the elderly woman and got off the bus. It moved away, belching dirty diesel smoke, and roared up the road towards Tring. Derek waved, and the woman waved back, and then he turned and walked into the village. Albury was a pretty place. It was a traditional English village, all thatched-roof cottages and a duck pond lined with weeds, with a small shop and a post office, and it had a pleasant-looking pub. It was a small rural community where everyone knew everyone. serene beneath the afternoon sun. He had loved living near here as a child. The countryside had been his only escape from so much unhappiness. Anywhere was better than the abuse and domestic violence that his father wrought upon him and his mother. Even a few hours' respite was better than nothing. He would spend hours in the woodland alone, or walking the footpaths across the fields, often until dark. It was when it was time to go home that he dreaded the hours that followed. He hated home, because he knew that old bastard would be waiting for him, ready to taunt him, and that was usually the prelude to an hour of abuse, sometimes mentally, often physically, and he would walk home meekly, his stomach churning with fear, his mind filled with dread and the impending menace that awaited him. But he put all that behind him. Past was past, and his tormentors had all gone away. He paced past the pub. There were 2 men sat outside drinking bitter. They nodded and watched him walk by. Derek lowered his head to an angle that obscured his face. Wasn't sure about those 2, so he thought it wise not to engage them. People talked when strangers arrived in the village, and Derek wanted to remain anonymous. It was prudent to remain in the shadows. He walked down the lane and leapt the fence, and then trudged across the open field. Although he wore a Simon shirt, it still felt warm. He had thoughtfully packed his denim jacket just in case the sun faded. He'd neatly rolled it in to fit in the rucksack, but it was way too warm for that. So he loosened another button and let the light breeze get to his sunburned chest. He walked on through the small copse and past the stream. He remembered walking Gillian this way. She had been so happy to be with him, and he had been happy to be with her. Of course the others had been jealous. They'd all ganged up on him and told him so. But young girls were so silly. Gillian may have been his favourite, but they knew that he loved them all equally. They all had a special place in his heart, and soon they would be reunited for the first time since 1969. They would all be together and one big jolly gang again. He glanced at his watch. Time was getting on, so he quickened his pace, across the field, then over another fence, and they'd be there, all happy to see him. He saw the old barn in the distance as he approached, and a feeling of euphoria hit him. He felt overwhelmed with happiness. As he drew closer, he was struck by the force of true love, and he felt his heart quicken in anticipation at the impending reunion. The barn was weather-faded, rotten, and in a terrible state. It had been in a desperate need of repair the last time he was here, but that didn't matter. The state of the barn was irrelevant. He pushed open the weather-worn doors. The hinges creaked their age and rusting despair. Inside it was cool, and smelled of dirty straw and old animal feces. He looked round, and then walked over to the rear of the barn and dropped to his knees. He parted the old straw until he found the heavy, wrought-iron ring. His mouth broke into a smile. "I'll soon be with you, my loves." Using both hands, he pulled the heavy slab upwards and moved it to one side. It took quite an effort after these past few years, but he eventually achieved his goal. He then grabbed his rucksack and carefully made his way down the rusted steps that led to the secondary storage area. It was pitch black down there, and he blindly foraged in the rucksack for the torch he had brought. He turned it on and set it down on the table. The small area was bathed in a wash of light. He looked around. Nothing had changed. It was still the same. It was his own personal place, his sanctum. It was a place where he and his friends could come and be alone and be away from the nasty, unfeeling world out there. He rotated the light and smiled. "Oh, my beloved girls!" cried Derek joyously as he fell to his knees. The torch threw a broad pool of illumination upon the 4 skeletons that hung from chains against the wall. Eyeless sockets and grinning skulls looked back, still wearing their fashions from the 1960s. Derek frowned. "Oh, girls, you've become so old-fashioned. You really do need to dress more fashionably. It's 1972. Things have changed. I'll have to treat you. Please, will you let me treat you?" He smiled. They were happy, and they accepted his kindness. Derek walked forward and reached up towards the blonde-haired skeleton. He carefully brought her down from the 2 sharp hooks that, when alive, had tore into her brain. The badly decomposed corpse wore patterned trousers, a filthy white blouse, and a hippie-style headband. A few wisps of hair fell, and Derek tut-tutted. "Careful now, careful," said the girl. "Don't handle me too roughly." "I won't, darling," said Derek softly as he lowered his true love to the soft straw floor. "I'll never hurt you. Never." He let his fingers entwine with hers, and she looked up at him and smiled. He ran his lips down her cheek and nuzzled her neck. He looked up at the others. "What about us?" the others said. "Don't forget us. You do love us too." "Now, don't get jealous, Wendy, Jane and Linda," said Derek as he mildly and jokingly chastised them. "I've plenty of time for you all. We have plenty of time, and we won't be disturbed. No one will bother us. This is our special place." The girls smiled and laughed. Derek let his hand run lovingly down the front of the skeleton's body. In eagerness to touch her, his fingers broke part of the brittle rib cage, and he swiftly drew back. "I'm so sorry, apologized Derek, his hand gently massaging the offended area. "I can be so clumsy at times." And in the darkness, the 5 friends giggled and laughed for hours. When Derek grew tired, he placed his girls back against the wall and winched them up from the ground. The 4 skeletons hung in a row, their putrid mouths set in bony grins. "Now, girls," said Derek, calmly and clearly, "you've all been far too lonely, so I'll be bringing you another girl for company. She's a nice girl. Her name is Louise, and she works in a pet shop down the road from where I'm staying. I'm sure you'll like her, so make her feel welcome when I bring her here." We will, said the whispers and giggles from the wall. Derek smiled and said his goodbyes. He turned off the light and made his way up the sepia-stained steps. He dropped the iron slab and covered the hole. His rucksack in hand, he placed the straw back over the slab, totally obscuring the portal to his secret place. It was getting dark as he left the barn, and he knew the bus service will have finished for the day. "Oh, you girls always distract me," he sighed as he walked across the field and back towards the village. "How will I get home now?" Then he suddenly remembered the pub in the village, and behind the pub was a car park, and some people drank alone and went back to their cars alone. He smiled and reached into his rucksack and tugged out a flick knife. He pushed a small button and watched the slim blade dart out. It glistened in the darkness, dangerous and razor sharp. He smiled to himself. Maybe he wouldn't have to hitch a ride home after all. A few minutes later, a lone patron came out of the pub and walked across the car park towards his car. He was a casually dressed middle-aged man, a local no doubt, one of the pub's regulars. Derek moved from out of the shadows and held the knife tightly. His ride home was assured, and he smiled as he furtively approached his unwitting victim.